March 5th, 2013. A hospital room in Caracas. A man is dying. The world believes this is a story about cancer, about a revolutionary's last breath, about the end of an era. But they're wrong. This is not a medical story. This is a story about a debt that couldn't be paid. A story about how Cuba, a bankrupt island 90 miles from Florida, managed to install a puppet president in the richest oil nation on earth. Because here's the truth they don't tell you. Venezuela didn't fall because of socialism. It fell because Havana owned the invoice. And when the bill came due, they collected. Not in dollars, in blood. Let's rewind to when Venezuela looked invincible. The year 2008. Oil is trading at $147 a barrel. Hugo Chavez stands in front of the United Nations and calls George Bush the devil. The crowd laughs. Chavez laughs. He has $300 billion in oil reserves backing his every word. Venezuela is feeding subsidized gasoline to its citizens at 2 cents per gallon. The government is building thousands of free houses. Doctors from Cuba are treating patients in the slums. The streets of Caracas are filled with red shirts and revolutionary songs. This is the golden age of the Bolivarian dream. The ledger shows massive revenue. The treasury is flush. Chavez is sending oil to 18 countries as gifts, as bribes, as geopolitical chess moves. But every empire, every fortune, every revolution has a balance sheet. And Venezuela's balance sheet had a cancer long before Chavez's body did. The cancer was Cuba. Since 1999, Venezuela had been sending 100,000 barrels of oil per day to the island. That's 36 million barrels per year. At $100 per barrel, that's $3.6 billion in annual subsidy. But here's the trick. Cuba wasn't paying. They were sending doctors and teachers and, most importantly, intelligence agents. It looked like a partnership. It was actually a protection racket. The Castro brothers had found their Soviet Union replacement, and they would do anything, absolutely anything, to keep that oil flowing. The addiction was mutual but asymmetric. Venezuela was addicted to the illusion of being a great power. Cuba was addicted to survival. When Chavez got sick in 2011, the panic in Havana was existential. Fidel and Raul Castro knew that if a nationalist military man took over in Caracas, he might look at the spreadsheet and ask a simple question: why are we giving billions to Cuba while our own hospitals lack medicine? That question could not be allowed, so they made sure it never got asked. They did this by controlling who would succeed Chavez, not through an election, not through a coup, through a hospital bed. Chavez didn't trust Venezuelan doctors. Cancer had made him paranoid. He flew to Havana for treatment in June 2011. He checked into the CIMAC hospital, a fortress of concrete and secrecy. The hospital became the de facto capital of Venezuela. Cabinet members flew in for meetings. Generals arrived to pledge loyalty. But every conversation, every decision, every whisper was monitored by Cuban intelligence, the G2. They controlled the medical reports. They controlled who saw Chavez and when. They controlled the flow of morphine and the flow of information. And in that controlled environment, they executed the most successful foreign intervention in Latin American history, not with tanks, with persuasion. There were 2 candidates for succession. On one side stood Diosdado Cabello, former paratrooper, veteran of the 1992 coup attempt, controller of military intelligence. A man with deep connections to every barracks in Venezuela, he was feared. He was ruthless, and he was a nationalist. The Cubans knew that Cabello would prioritize Venezuela over ideology. He might keep the oil flowing, but he would demand something in return. He would negotiate. He was a bad debtor. On the other side stood Nicolas Maduro, former bus driver for the Caracas Metro, union organizer, tall, mustachioed, awkward in front of cameras. The Venezuelan elite marked him as uneducated, but the Castros saw something the elites missed. Maduro was theirs. In 1988, long before Chavez rose to power, a young Nicolas Maduro had traveled to Cuba. He attended the School of Political Formation in Havana. This was not a university. It was a recruitment center. Latin American leftists came to learn Marxism, to study guerrilla tactics, to absorb the mythology of the Cuban Revolution. But more importantly, they were vetted. Cuban intelligence built files on every student. They identified the true believers. They identified the ones who could be controlled. Maduro passed the test. He looked up to Fidel with the eyes of a disciple meeting a prophet. He memorized the speeches. He absorbed the doctrine. And when he returned to Venezuela, he carried something invisible, a leash. The Castros spent months at Chavez's bedside, hour after hour of whispered conversations. They reminded him of past betrayals by military men. They told him that only a civilian could preserve the purity of the revolution. They praised Maduro's loyalty, his humility, his working-class roots. They told Chavez that Maduro would be the son who would protect his legacy. We don't have transcripts of those conversations. The walls of CIMEC don't have ears that speak to journalists, but we can read the ledger. We can see the result. On October 7, 2012, Chavez won his last election. Days later, he appointed Maduro as vice president. The succession was set, but Chavez's health was collapsing faster than projected. The cancer had metastasized to his lungs. Infections were ravaging his body. By December, he was barely conscious most days. The government released photos of him reading a newspaper, smiling with his daughters. All staged. All lies. He was dying, and the Cubans needed one final performance. On December 8, 2012, Chavez appeared on national television. He sat at a table flanked by Maduro and Cabello. His face was swollen from steroids. His voice was weak, but his message was clear as a contract. He told Venezuela that if he could not continue, they must elect Nicolas Maduro. He called it his firm and irrevocable opinion. It was a deathbed command, a transfer of political capital from beyond the grave. Watch that broadcast again. Look at Cabello's face, stone, silent, watching his ambition evaporate. The military option was dead. Havana had won. Chavez flew back to Cuba immediately. He underwent surgery on December 11th. There were complications. Massive bleeding. Respiratory failure. He was intubated and sedated. For the next 3 months, Venezuela was ruled by a ghost. Decrees were issued in his name. Documents were signed with his signature. But journalists later proved that the handwriting didn't match. The ink analysis showed the signatures were forged. It was a zombie presidency. And during that twilight period, Maduro and his Cuban handlers moved to lock down power. They purged intelligence officers loyal to Cabello. They placed Cuban advisors inside the Defense Ministry to monitor communications. They secured the loyalty of the Supreme Court and the National Electoral Council with promises and threats. By the time Chavez died on March 5, 2013, the institutional coup was already complete. Maduro appeared on television to announce the death. He wore a white shirt and spoke with manufactured grief. But his first act wasn't mourning, it was mobilization. He expelled American diplomats. He activated the military. He declared economic war. The mask was already slipping. Now comes the constitutional crisis. Venezuelan law was clear. If a president dies, the head of the National Assembly becomes interim president and calls elections within 30 days. The head of the assembly was Diosdado Cabello. This was his legal moment, his constitutional right. But the Supreme Court, packed with loyalists, issued a ruling that shocked legal scholars worldwide. They declared that Maduro, as vice president, would become interim president and could run in the election without stepping down. It was legal absurdity, a constitutional crime. But the judges had their orders, and Cabello, surrounded by Cuban-monitored military units, chose survival over rebellion. He swallowed the humiliation. The election was set for April 14, 2013. 10 days of campaigning, the shortest in Venezuelan history. Maduro didn't run as himself. He ran as a medium channeling Chavez. He mentioned Chavez's name 7,500 times in speeches. He played recordings of Chavez singing. He claimed that Chavez appeared to him as a little bird that whistled blessings in a chapel. The opposition candidate, Enrique Capriles, campaigned on reality. He talked about the murder rate, 73 homicides per 100,000 people. He talked about inflation hitting 30%. He talked about hospitals running out of supplies. But Maduro had the state, the oil money, and the grief of millions. Election night. The results? Maduro 50.6%. Capriles 49.1%, a margin of 225,000 votes. It was statistically impossible given the exit polls. The opposition cried fraud. They presented evidence of 3,200 irregularities. They demanded a recount. Protests exploded in the streets. This was the test. Would the military defend a bus driver who stole an election? The answer came within hours. The high command appeared on television in full uniform. They pledged absolute loyalty to President Maduro, not to the Constitution, to the man. The Cuban playbook had worked. They had bought the generals, not with ideology, with cash. Here's where the economic trap springs shut. Maduro inherited an economy that was already bleeding. Chavez had spent a decade printing money to fund social programs. The inflation rate was hidden through price controls and currency manipulation. Venezuela had 4 different exchange rates. The official rate said $1 equaled 6.3 bolivars. The black market rate was 25 bolivars. This gap was a printing press for corruption. Government officials would get dollars at the official rate and sell them on the black market for 400% profit. Billions were stolen. The oil revenue that should have built hospitals and roads evaporated into offshore accounts. Then came the hammer. In mid-2014, global oil prices collapsed from $110 per barrel in June to $50 by December. Venezuela's revenue dropped by 60% in 6 months. A normal government would adjust, cut spending, devalue currency, seek IMF assistance. But Maduro was trapped. To cut social spending would betray Chavez's legacy. To devalue would admit failure. To seek help from the IMF would violate revolutionary doctrine. So he chose the worst option: print money, The central bank began running the printing presses day and night. The money supply doubled, then tripled. And the ledger doesn't lie. When you print money without producing goods, you get inflation. By 2016, inflation hit 800%. By 2018, it reached 1,000,000%. Hyperinflation. The bolivar became worthless paper. A teacher's monthly salary was worth $3. People began weighing cash instead of counting it. You needed a bag of bills to buy bread. The middle class evaporated. Doctors fled the country. Engineers left. Teachers left. The brain drain turned into a hemorrhage. Between 2015 and 2025, 7.7 million Venezuelans fled. That's 25% of the population. The largest refugee exodus in Western Hemisphere history. Larger than Syria in absolute numbers. But through it all, the oil kept flowing to Cuba. Even when Venezuelan hospitals had no power, the tankers left for Havana. Even when children were starving, 50,000 barrels per day went north. The debt was being paid, not in currency, in suffering. Because sovereignty is solvency. And Venezuela was no longer sovereign. Maduro had sold the country in pieces. He took $60 billion in loans from China, payable in future oil. He gave Russia ownership of Citgo, Venezuela's U.S.-based refining company, as collateral for loans. He invited Iran to send gasoline because Venezuelan refineries had collapsed from lack of maintenance. The country with the world's largest oil reserves was importing gasoline. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. The protests came in waves. 2014, 2017, 2019. Millions in the streets, barricades burning, students fighting police with rocks. The world watched and predicted Maduro's fall. No government survives single-digit approval ratings. But Maduro had the Cuban manual. He unleashed the FAES Special Action Forces, death squads in black uniforms with skull masks. They raided homes at night. They executed protest leaders. Over 5,000 extrajudicial killings documented by the UN. He weaponized food. The sheep lap boxes, subsidized food packages, were only given to those with the fatherland card. To get the card, you had to show loyalty. Vote correctly. Attend rallies. The government turned hunger into a control mechanism. In 2018, Maduro dropped the pretense. He held an election but banned opposition parties. He jailed popular candidates. International observers were expelled. It was a coronation, not an election. 50 countries refused to recognize the result. In January 2019, Juan Guaido, head of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president under constitutional provisions. The U.S., EU, and Latin American nations recognized him. For a moment it looked like the end. Diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, internal military pressure, but the uprising never came because the generals did the math. In a democracy, they'd face trials for corruption and drug trafficking. With Maduro, they stayed rich. They chose the ledger. Here's the number that explains everything. The cartel of the suns. That's what they call the network of Venezuelan generals who control the cocaine trade. The U.S. Treasury estimates they move 250 tons of cocaine per year through Venezuela. That's $10 billion in revenue. The generals don't just tolerate the drug trade. They run it. They use military planes. They use naval vessels. The defense minister himself was indicted by the U.S. Justice Department. So when the opposition offered amnesty, the generals looked at their bank accounts and laughed. They had too much to lose. Maduro gave them a country to loot. The opposition offered them a jail cell. Let's talk about the ghost period. December 2012 to March 2013. 90 days when Chavez was legally alive but functionally dead. During this period, the government issued 3,200 decrees in his name. They devalued the currency by 32%. They signed oil contracts with China. They appointed ministers. But Chavez was intubated in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to sign. Forensic analysis of the signatures on official documents showed inconsistencies, different pen pressure, different stroke angles. Handwriting experts hired by opposition lawyers concluded that at least 40% were forgeries. It was a paper coup, a bureaucratic theft of democracy, and it worked because the Supreme Court refused to investigate. Think about the scale of that deception. An entire nation was governed by forged signatures for 3 months. Laws were passed. Budgets were approved. International treaties were signed, all by a man who was clinically incapable of reading them. This wasn't just fraud. It was the nullification of constitutional order, and it established a precedent for everything that followed. If you can fake a president's signature, you can fake an election. If you can fake an election, you can fake a democracy. Venezuela became a theatrical production. The set looked like a republic, but behind the curtain were Cuban intelligence officers writing the script. The geopolitical dimension is crucial. The U.S. imposed sanctions in 2017, cut off Venezuelan oil exports, froze government assets. The goal was to strangle the regime economically. In a vacuum, it would have worked, but Maduro had alternatives. Russia stepped in with $17 billion in loans and investment. China extended credit lines. Iran sent fuel tankers escorted by military vessels. Turkey bought Venezuelan gold at a discount to evade sanctions. Maduro transformed Venezuela into a case study for sanctions evasion. He used cryptocurrency. He used shell companies. He used barter trade. The regime survived not through strength, but through the cracks in the international financial system. And Cuba got its payment through all the chaos, through the starvation, through the collapse. The oil flowed. Estimates suggest that between 2013 and 2023, Venezuela sent $25 billion worth of oil to Cuba at below-market rates or for free. That's $25 billion stolen from Venezuelan hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. That's the price of the Havana succession. Cuba installed Maduro. Maduro paid the invoice. The Venezuelan people paid the cost. This is not a metaphor. This is accounting. The ledger is written in crude oil and human misery. By 2020, Venezuela's GDP had collapsed by 75%. That's a greater economic contraction than the U.S. Great Depression. That's comparable to Germany after World War I. Unemployment hit 50%. The healthcare system disintegrated. Diseases that had been eradicated for decades returned: malaria, diphtheria, measles. Infant mortality tripled. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds between 2016 and 2019 due to lack of food. They called it the Maduro diet. Hospitals performed surgeries without anesthesia. Patients brought their own gloves and sutures. Caracas, once the richest city in South America, became a dystopian shell. Buildings crumbled. Water was rationed. Electricity failed for days. But Maduro survives. As of 2025, he's still in the palace. He's outlasted 4 American presidents who swore to remove him. He's outlasted the mass protests. He's outlasted the international isolation. He wears expensive Italian suits now. He dances salsa on state television. His wife controls the food distribution network and has become one of the richest women in Latin America. He's no longer the awkward bus driver who needed a bird to talk to Chavez. He's a survivor, a graduate of the Cuban School of Authoritarian Endurance. He learned that you don't need to be loved. You need to control the food, the guns, and the information. Here's the generational cost. Venezuela's debt, both foreign and domestic, is estimated at $200 billion. The country defaulted in 2017 and hasn't made payments since. But debt doesn't disappear. It accrues interest. It compounds. By the time Venezuela returns to democratic governance, the debt will likely exceed $300 billion. At current GDP levels, that's 300% of the economy. It would take 2 generations of austerity to pay it off.